And we're back with chapter 13 in Romans. Such a dicey chapter, quoted for all sorts of purposes. And today, we're going to do our best to set the record straight. I'm Jeremy, joined as always by my friend Jeff.
I don't know who needs to hear this, but shut up and pay your taxes.
What's that from?
The culture, cultural zeitgeist. Romans 13. It's not a quote from something.
I just assumed, it's some archive movie.
There's so many people out there who are, complaining about, death and taxes, like how looking for creative ways to avoid paying the piper. But, just read Romans 13. Just, you're not supposed to complain about that stuff. You're supposed to do it.
Romans 13 is an interesting chapter. We're going to get into this today. But before we do, we have more pressing matters at hand. Jeff, I have finally watched the movie Pig.
I know. Congratulations. I'm so happy.
I didn't want to be shamed by you for another week in a row in front of our listeners and those who watch. So I decided to go watch it. And I will just say, it's the setup or the parallels to John Wick are borderline comical at the beginning.
Uncanny.
Right out of the gate, you get the something happened to his wife. And they have this guy. Then it's just him and the pig.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the setup to John Wick 1 and Pig are very funny. And almost where I thought, this is a joke. This is not a real thing.
It's got to be intentional, I would think. I didn't really look at because Pig came out just a couple years ago. So, I mean, there would have been enough time for them to write and direct this as a reaction to John Wick. Certainly an influence, I would think. Yeah.
For sure. So I'll just say, this is me being honest. The title did nothing to entice me. Not a Nicolas Cage fan. Mm-hmm. And then, it starts off and I'm just like, what has Jeff got me into? I was a little confused. But I gotta say, it won me over in spades and was truly a beautiful story. And I don't want to spoil it because I suspect most people listening or watching this have not seen it because it's not much to your chagrin. It's not a well-known,
not like a mainstream movie,
right?
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to spoil anything major, but I'm just gonna say I heartily endorse this. In fact, I told my 14-year-old and my wife, I'm like, hey, I want to rewatch this with you guys. I think it'd be good. And I've thought about the movie quite a few times since I watched it last week. And that to me is the sign of a good movie when, or a good book or anything, when you're finished with it and yet something in it lingers on and you can't move beyond it because you keep revisiting it. So thanks for the recommendation. I dig it.
Hey, thank you for watching it. Yeah, I'm so pleased. So happy that you liked it. I was afraid that you would think it was boring or pretentious or too obtuse or something like that, but I appreciate your enthusiasm and appreciation for fine cinema, Jeremy.
Is that what this is? Is fine cinema? You can tell that this thing is made on a shoestring budget, and there's not it's the anti-John Wick on almost every sense. This is not a blockbuster. There's not a ton of actors. There's not car chases. I mean, it's not that. But the story itself is so good and so beautiful, and just so much of I think they captured what the human condition is and how we deal with loss and how we deal with pain, and I'm gonna say this was maybe one of Cage's better roles. This was good stuff.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I mean, Nicolas Cage is a fascinating human being for sure. And yeah, I'll admit he's phoned in plenty of performances. He's turned in plenty of incredibly, amazingly, beautifully bad performances. But he's a good actor when he wants to be, in my opinion. And
I agree, and I think he wanted to be in this movie.
Yeah, yeah. Pig is a movie that he cares about. I remember because there was the recent Nicolas Cage movie, The Unbearable Weight of Massive Talent, and so which is this meta movie where Nicolas Cage plays himself. And I believe in one of the interviews with that, where he was kind of doing a retrospective on his career, and he was asked to name what are the roles he's most proud of. I believe Pig was in his top 3, which was surprising considering he's been a working actor for decades now, and Pig is a relatively recent film. So
Well, and he's been in, blockbuster movies. So
yeah, he didn't say National Treasure too somehow, but Pig made the cut.
You know what's interesting about the movie, that you don't like him, or at least I didn't at the beginning of the movie. I was not immediately drawn to him as a
Hmm.
character. And that's where I
Mm-hmm.
was kind of like, this is going to be a long movie, like oh
Yeah.
gosh. And then it's almost just intentionally, slowly, strategically opens you up to like him more and more and more. And by the time the movie ends, you have this like really, at least I did, this really deep connection. And it reminds me a little bit of the way they did storytelling in Breaking Bad, where it was so subtle, the shift of the character, that you almost didn't notice it. And then, if you like watch episode 1 and then watch the finale, you're like, this is a totally different
Yeah.
person. And it's because of how they slowly built that. I felt like they did that same concept in this movie, and it was just good.
But
I'm blown away.
sort of the opposite of Breaking Bad, you mean, where like at the beginning of Breaking Bad, Walt is a nice, sympathetic character, and by the end, he's completely unredeemable.
I just mean the idea of they're going to slowly change something, and they're going to do it strategically, but slowly enough where you don't necessarily notice it happening until the
Mm-hmm.
end, and you realize, oh, I feel totally different than I did at the beginning. That's
Yeah.
what I mean. Like by the end of the movie, I'm like, I'm really drawn to this guy. When did that happen? It was like there's not like one scene that all of a sudden you're like, oh, I like him. It's like they just
Hmm.
slowly draw you into this guy. And yeah, not that he's changing character as much as like Breaking Bad, but
Mm-hmm.
just this meticulous,
As you
we're going to
learn more
draw
about
you in.
him.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's so good. There it is,
Wow.
everybody. I think
There
we
it
need to
is.
like get a poll out there, get our people to watch it, and see who resonates with it.
Yeah, a
Is,
is
is
a
it just you and
recommendation
I,
from both
or
of
is it
us.
is it all of the Forest and Trees community? I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Anyone, if you've listened to us rant and rave about this movie that no one's even heard of for for 5 minutes now, and you're curious, do check it out. You can, like I told Jeremy, you can stream it on Canopy, at least through the Phoenix Public Library system. I don't know how you watched it, Jeremy.
I ended up doing it on Amazon Prime.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, the other thing you didn't even mention, and you would have sold me on this so much faster. So just heads up, it all takes place in Portland, or like the
Oh yeah,
Oregon, yeah, the Portland, area, which
that's
is
true.
like my favorite place. I love
Yeah.
that. I was actually in Oregon this last week when I downloaded it, and I was gonna watch it on the plane, and then I ended up not doing that, and I watched it when I got home. But
Oh
um,
yeah.
yeah, so it's already like in my favorite place. I mean, it's like the movie just kept getting better and better as I got into it. So,
Did you visit one of those gastronomy type restaurants while you were in
um,
Portland?
so I actually read a little bit about it. Like they're like the underground tunnels and stuff he goes in. It's super cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of Portland that's very much like that, and
Mm-hmm.
and like the opening scenes, when he's out in the woods, it's just gorgeous. Like that's like my favorite landscape in Oregon. It's just so pretty. So
Yeah.
there you go, everybody. There you go.
There you go.
Although,
Watch
based
Pig.
on the last poll you did, I think it was the last poll. They may not love it like we did, because I think you asked that poll of, is there ever a
Oh,
reason to
is
use
violence
violence? Yeah.
ever justified? Yeah, I think it was like 65-35, something like that. 65 like pro
I
violence.
thought your follow up was funny of, remind me never to get
Not
on
again the bad side.
65% of our listeners' bad side.
Yeah, yeah.
So maybe that 65% are more John Wick fans. I don't know.
Totally. Totally.
All right. Should we talk about Romans?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would love to talk about Pig for an hour, but I mean, I don't want to get into spoilers, so
Okay.
maybe another time.
Fair enough. Fair enough. All right. Let's talk Romans 13. Today, we are going to explore God's role with earthly governments, the nature of love. This will be very philosophical. And we're going to try to figure out whether God is actually coming back soon or not, and why it matters, or maybe it doesn't matter. We'll find out. Before we get into Jeff's questions, I'd like to set the tone. Romans 13, verse 14, love the imagery Paul uses here, says, clothe yourself with the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ. I just love the idea of like, wrap Jesus around you like a shawl, and that's your outfit for the day. And Jeff, you're a fan of the one outfit look. That's
Mm-hmm.
your shtick.
Yeah.
And, maybe you could just clothe yourself with Jesus and every day just put Jesus on. Something to consider.
Yeah, I should wash my my dirty brown t-shirts and make them sparkling white, right?
Well, who knows what Jesus would do to your wardrobe? But I don't know. I like the image. Clothe yourself with the presence of Jesus, which is not just like the idea of Jesus, but like the real person, which is obviously very much how I try to live out my faith. Not just this Jesus that I read about, but the Jesus that I experience as well. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, cool image. Clothes make the man. I can dig it.
There you go.
All right. Well, you ready to get into the chapter then,
Let's
Jeremy?
do it. I'm ready.
Let's do it. All right. So this is as I alluded to right at the start of this episode, this is the real respect for governing authorities chapter of Romans. So right from the beginning in verse 1 it says everyone must submit to governing authorities, for all authority comes from God, and those in positions of authority have been placed there by God. So as I was like reading this chapter, and especially this statement right here, this is a pretty extraordinary statement in my view. The claim that every single person in a governing authority has been placed there specifically by God. And I wonder, does anyone really take this seriously? Because I've thought a lot about some of our political offices in the world that are like officially sanctioned by God, like the Pope, the King of England, the Dalai Lama, things like that. I feel like most people, even who are admirers, who are non-critics of these political leaders, they don't like actually literally believe God put them there. But Paul is basically claiming that every single politician, from the king of Saudi Arabia to your local sheriff, is placed there for a reason. It's not about like government corruption or nepotism or being born into money or anything like that. They're placed there for the right reason. Which the more I think about it, the more absurd it seems. But and it also implies that God is responsible for the political dysfunction and gridlock that we have in our world today. So that's my question for you, Jeremy. Why doesn't God do a better job of selecting our political leaders?
Did you say you don't think the Pope thinks that he was picked by God?
Do I think the Pope personally does, or do I think like most Catholics believe that, or what do you mean? What's the question?
I don't know. I think I was trying to, I thought I heard you say, yeah, but the Pope knows he wasn't picked by God.
Yeah, well, that's obviously there's no way to know, but I guess that's kind of a pet theory I have that like the Pope is a serious person, and in his private moments, sitting on his golden throne, he probably realizes that this is just a human institution that I'm just playing along with. Like I wasn't actually divinely appointed.
Hot take on the Pope. Woo.
Do you believe he buys his own BS, as they say?
Well, this Pope intrigues. I think we've talked a little about him. This Pope intrigues me more than some of the previous popes, because he doesn't seem as enamored with the office of the role of the Pope as others have been.
Sure,
but I and again, I don't know. I would suspect he would say that he was picked by God. It's just an interesting idea of like, does the Pope in his heart not believe that?
Does he even believe it?
Right, yeah, which would make it hard to be Pope, I think. I mean, maybe a lot of them throughout history. There's some obviously bad popes, but anyways, that's not really your question. Just I thought I'd explore that for a second. That's a great question based on just an initial surface level reading of that verse, which I would say, is inherently problematic if you just read that verse at face value and go, I'm just going to take it as it is. God, you're not good at this. Like you don't do a very good job picking the leaders. And now does God, share some responsibility for how it goes wrong? I'm going to go out on a limb, and I don't use this argument a lot. I think there are times when you do want to use it. I'm going to say this is not a great translation of this verse or the idea Paul was saying. And so I was like, I really don't think that's what Paul's trying to argue here. So I was doing a little research into other translations. My guy, David Bentley Hart, I think nailed it with his translation of this verse, which I think is actually the point Paul is trying to make, which you'll notice is very similar, but is a different emphasis that makes a huge difference. So the way David Bentley Hart translates Romans 13:1, he says, let every soul be subordinate to higher authorities. For there is no authority except under God, and such as exist are subordinated to God. So Hart is basically making this translation of Paul's argument is not God handpicked them as if God likes that one and doesn't like the other one, but that God ultimately has all authority. So any earthly authority is only because God has allowed it to exist, or you could say extended, some of the authority God has to allow earthly leaders to have some type of authority, which I think is much more the point Paul is making. Like, it's a focus on God, not on these leaders, saying the only reason you have earthly leaders is because God has allowed people to have earthly authority. God has all authority. And if God didn't allow anyone, there would be no other earthly authorities. If God is the person that, I think Paul believes him to be, God has all authority. So that's, I think, the argument. So basically, earthly authorities only have authority because God has authority and God has allowed them to have some, I think, is the point Paul is trying to make. So I would say it's more accurate to say God uses the leaders in power to God's own ends rather than God handpicks the leaders he really likes for whatever reason. And I would connect this back to a verse we talked about last week in chapter 12. In Romans 12:19, we read this: "Dear friends, never take revenge. Leave that to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures say, I will take revenge. I will pay them back, says the Lord." Now, we find this kind of theme throughout even the New Testament, that God does use earthly governments for God's ultimate purposes without them necessarily following God. And I think this is the point Paul is making about God. God has ultimate authority. God will use the governing authorities however God wants to use them to ultimately bring about the ends that God has. And so I think all this you got to keep in mind of the way in which Paul is talking about Rome, which was a very significant reality to anyone living in the time of Paul. Rome was everything to them, the way that Rome did it. And so I want to read a quote that I think puts so much of this whole thing in context. This is I think, one of the most helpful quotes on Romans 13. This comes from a guy named Derek Flood. There's a book called Disarming Scripture, which I recommend. It's a great book. But he specifically addresses the context in which Paul is writing Romans 13 in light of Rome and all of this. And so this is a little bit long, my dear listeners, but I think this is worth sitting on and understanding the argument that Derek Flood's making. So here's what he says. Romans 13, 1-7 must be understood in the context of the volatile relationship that the Jews, as well as the early church, had under the oppressive rule of Rome. So Derek's saying, read Romans 13 with, this eye to how they lived under Rome. Remember, he says, that Paul himself was charged with crimes by the state, beaten multiple times, jailed, and eventually executed by Rome. Okay, it's history. So to see Paul as a cheerleader for the goodness of the Roman imperial state under Nero is to miss the volatile and hostile historical reality of Paul's situation at the time. We thus see in Romans 12-13 a snapshot of Paul's attempt to navigate the church in Rome through a volatile and dangerous relationship with a violent regime, modeling the way of enemy love rather than the way of retaliation, which is all that we talked about in Romans 12 last week. It says, taking Romans 12 and 13 together, Paul's counsel to the church in Rome is, do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, Romans 12:2, but do not commit an act of open insurrection that will result in bringing down the crushing arm of the Roman state either. In other words, Paul is telling the church in Rome to resist via the means of overcoming evil with good, not through the means of retaliation and insurrection, a way he knows will lead to mass bloodshed. So this is really what he's arguing, and I agree with this. This is Paul's instruction to the church to live countercultural without saying, oh, we're going to defy Rome. Let's go take arms against Rome, which would get them all slaughtered and is not the way of Jesus. And he's saying, no, I'm teaching you how to do this, how to stand up to Rome by acknowledging the only authority they have is the authority God has allowed them to have, which then puts everything, like, you can take a deep breath. Like, God is ultimately the one in control. So relax when you see God allowing something to happen. And this is, I think, a way of Paul navigating the church through a government that's going to kill him. I mean, again, you read this in context. Like, we know that Paul was executed by Rome. So you have to keep that in mind throughout Romans, especially Romans 13, when he's talking about the authority. And to me, that is way more of a, oh, that makes sense explanation than Paul as, cheerleader of Rome.
That makes sense to me. I mean, especially like the first thing you said about it when you were talking, I was kind of picturing like the org chart, right? Like God is just like it, like in charge by default. So like it doesn't really matter who the middle managers are,
Correct.
like, and like how competent or incompetent they are. Like God is still like in charge.
All lines point up to God.
Yeah, right. Whether or not his subordinates are like actually doing anything productive for him or not. So that makes more sense to me. And of course, yeah, another thing was like what Paul's saying here at surface level doesn't really make sense with free will, right? Like if free will exists, then it wouldn't make sense for God to be interfering with all our elections.
Right.
Yeah, I guess that's another thing is that Paul is shockingly subordinate, I guess is the word, right, to governing authorities, which, like, as you rightly point out, like ancient Rome was probably a much harsher government than anything that we're dealing with right now in America, however much we might disagree with whatever the government is up to. I don't know. I'm kind of surprised, or not surprised. It seems strange to me that he seems to like not even be for like peaceful protest. Like last week we were talking about Gandhi a little bit with nonviolence. I feel like Gandhi's method of nonviolent resistance, like nonviolent non-cooperation, it seems like Paul, according to Romans 13, wouldn't even necessarily support that for to protest a corrupt government. He would say that you should just keep your head down and be a good citizen no matter what, basically.
Well, I think according to, Flood's quote that I read,
Mm-hmm.
he's basically trying to keep the church from getting annihilated, by Rome, which you got to remember that was the Roman way. It's like,
sure, right.
Anybody rises up, you just kill them all. You put them on, crosses. You line a major road with them, and you leave the bodies up as a warning to anyone that defies Rome.
Mm-hmm.
So we think today of like, oh yeah, stand up against America. Well, great. You can go protest anything. I mean, you could protest, against Biden if you wanted. You could protest against Trump if you wanted, and you're probably not going to lose your life on either end of that, right? You
Mm-hmm.
have the freedom. So we think of it like that. That was not this culture. So Paul's literally, I think, trying to keep the church alive, saying, no, like don't go. And I, shockingly, both Paul and especially Jesus had like little to no interest in reforming Rome.
Mm-hmm.
Like that just wasn't a focus of them. Americans who are Christian have a deep desire. We got to bring this country back or get it on track. That is not something you find in the early church. They weren't super concerned about, we got to make Rome reformed and get all the, get it right. They were more focused on being the church. And that's, I think, what Paul's inviting them to be is like, look, let the authority that they have be the authority that they have. You are called to follow Jesus and do it in this radical way. And, he's inviting them to focus on that, knowing he himself is going to get killed by this government. And so are a lot of them.
It also seems to sort of contradict or just be different to like the story of Jesus and the story of like a lot of the apostles of the early church and Paul himself, in terms of, because they were killed by the state. But like in Romans 13, Paul seems to be more measured and pragmatic here by saying that don't be outspoken against the government even if you disagree with whatever they're preaching.
Well, you do wonder, he's writing to the church in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
So
right.
You do wonder if he has a slightly different message to them.
Yeah.
Because of location, of like, hey guys, like you really are not going to get away with this. You're in the hot spot here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it just kind of goes against like the idea of like martyrdom. Like, should all Christians be martyred like the stories of the early apostles and everything, or is it better to kind of play the long game and just play along and pay your taxes and stuff and put up with even when the government like institutes fear and like that by extension is God instituting fear in its citizens. That was another idea in this first section that kind of bothered me a little bit. If it seems like totally makes sense to me that yeah, the government in general is going to be corrupt and use fear tactics, but isn't God supposed to be more of the loving type?
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know.
All right. Well, speaking of love, let's transition on to the next
Ooh,
verse
you
here.
you and your transitions, so good.
Yeah, yeah, silky smooth. So verse 10 says, "Love does no wrong to others, so love fulfills the requirements of God's law." So this whole section is kind of mirroring what Jesus talks about in the Gospels when he talks about like the two greatest commandments of all of the law, all of the Old Testament. You can just sum it up with love God and love your neighbor. And
Mhm.
then Paul here in Romans 13 specifically is saying that it's all summed up by just loving your neighbor, which is kind of interesting because I remember we talked about that before of like, yeah, I totally agree with that idea of like we should all love each other, we should all get along. And Paul is skipping the God part, which is kind of the more controversial aspect because like not everyone agrees on whether or not there's a God out there to love or not. I mean, I like this message. This is a message that resonates with me. I remember like reading the New Testament in my early 20s and just having this kind of profound epiphany of like, oh, it's all about love. It's like that's the message of Christianity. That's what's so great about Christianity is you brush all the rules away and we just care for one another. And I would say that as I've explored more world philosophies, I no longer think that this is completely unique to Christianity. I think there's a lot of people who've kind of come to this epiphany. And of course, it's totally like hippy dippy and cliche and naive, but it is still profound, I would argue. Just this idea that all you need is love. And people like the Beatles and Oprah. And I think of Elon Musk when he was smoking a J on the Joe Rogan Experience. He said,
This may sound corny.
It does sound corny,
but love is the answer.
I guess that makes me wonder, like, what sets the Christian version of we should all just love one another apart from the kind of mainstream world version of love? So that's my question. What's so special about the Christian flavor of love?
I love this question. That's a really good question, and I agree with you. It's not the love in and of itself is not what makes Christianity unique, and you can find it all over the place. I think the challenge in answering the question is how are we defining love? Because even if we agree with, Elon, love is the answer. Great. What do we mean by that? Like, what do we mean by love?
Mm-hmm.
For Christians, I think the answer is God. Like, God is love, and love must therefore be constructed out of a framework of God. And then I would even go further than that and say it should be a Jesus looking God if you're going to follow Jesus, because that's who the New Testament writers point to, right? That's what God looks like. So, okay, if I want to develop a Christian ethic of love, I'm going to base it on the person of Jesus. And to me, one of the best passages to do this with would be 1 John 4, verses 7 through 13, where, he lays it out of like, what does this look like? He says, "Dear friends, let us continue to love one another, for love comes from God. Anyone who loves is a child of God and knows God. But anyone who does not love does not know God, for God is love. God showed how much he loved us by sending his one and only Son into the world so that we might have eternal life through him. This is real love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as a sacrifice to take away our sins. Dear friends, since God loved us that much, we surely ought to love each other. No one has ever seen God, but if we love each other, God lives in us, and his love is brought to full expression in us." Which is a radical sentence there. "And God has given us his Spirit as proof that we live in him and he in us." So John is making verses 12 and 13 are like hugely profound that I think we just skip over. Notice what he says: no one has ever seen God.
Mm-hmm.
Like any Jew in the Old Testament would be like, hold on, we have stories. Like Moses saw God. They would like Abraham talked to God. Like they would be quick to be like, whoa. They, what about the burning bush? What about the pillar of fire in the cloud of smoke? Like, what about all these things, right? He goes, no one has seen God. But he says this, but if we love each other, God lives in us, and it is through our love that he is brought to full expression. This love of God is brought to full expression in us. Like we manifest the person of Jesus when we love each other the way God has loved us, which is a radical thought that John is trying to say. And then he says, and God has given us his Spirit as proof. So he connects the Holy Spirit to this. And so to me, the Christian answer, or the Christian flavor of love, to use your phrase, is based on the person of Jesus. It is modeling who Jesus is, who not only we've seen Jesus to be, who we experience Jesus to be today, right? And then bringing that to full expression in the way that I treat others. And, this is it's not the golden rule, it's the platinum rule. It says, as I have loved you, go and love one another, is what Jesus says. So we are to love as Jesus has loved us, which is beyond just, hey, I'm going to love you the way I want to be loved. No, I'm going to love you the way God has loved me. That's my goal, to do that. And that is an incredible way of love. So to me, that is the Christian flavor, which does have parallels, right, to other religions and other things, but I would say is uniquely Christian because they're not all going to keep pointing back to Jesus as the litmus test of, does this look like Jesus? They would point elsewhere probably. And so to me, the Christian flavor of love is trying to bring, the love of God into full expression, as John says, in us. How does that sound?
Yeah, I think I agree with most of that. Other than wasn't there a line there, I don't have it in front of me, where it said like, anyone who doesn't know God doesn't know love or something like that? Or
anyone who does not love does not know God.
Oh, okay.
So he's saying, so maybe don't claim that you are following Jesus if you are not actually loving the people around you, which is Paul's argument here when he says, like, love your neighbor is really all you need, because if you understand how Jesus set that up, you can't love God without loving your neighbor. So if I'm loving my neighbor, I am loving God. And that's so I think it's almost like they keep reducing it even simpler, but it's the same exact message. If I'm loving my neighbor as Jesus, that is how I love God. So I'm also loving God in that process. But I think you have to understand, there's a lot of people in this culture and in ours that are like, no, I'm just going to love God. Screw my neighbor. Like, I don't have to do anything to my neighbor. I don't owe them anything. Who is my neighbor? We keep asking that question today over and over. Yeah. And, I want to be able to hate the people that I want to hate. And I think what you find in these New Testament writers is like, no, not if you want to love God.
I appreciate that. I am very attracted to that picture of God. Of course, I feel like that's a big part of why there's so much confusion about the God of the Bible, because there's so many pictures of like a violent God, but he still like calls himself love and says God is love. So that it seems to create a lot of unnecessary confusion, I would say. I don't know. It kind of gets into the whole like faith versus works thing a little bit, because like passages like this and a lot of like the parables of Jesus seem to suggest that it's more about the outpouring of what you do. It's more about like those who really loved are the ones who are in the kingdom. This idea of like it would lead me to conclude that like atheists who do a better job of loving people are more likely to get into heaven than Christians who are unloving. I don't know if you agree with that statement.
Well, I'm a Christian universalist, so I think everyone's gonna come to terms with Jesus. But we've talked about this. I do agree with you that I think there are atheists who act more like Christians than some Christians do, based on the premise of, are you actually loving people genuinely?
So to go back to like what I was asking about with like all these other examples from art and pop culture and stuff like that, like would you say that this idea of love like comes from God, comes from Jesus, or do you think like people can just like come to this realization on their own that, oh yeah, love is the most important thing in the universe without having like encountered the person of Jesus. What do you think about that?
I think you could get to it from all sorts of angles.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. What's the expression? Not all roads lead to Jesus, but Jesus can be found walking on all roads. You know, that idea of, I don't think every world religion is the same. I don't think they all mean the same thing at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you can find on ramps to Jesus through everything, because I think all truth ultimately points to Jesus. So yeah, I think if you, as you know, or not you, but just some person as an atheist
Mm-hmm.
decides, hey, I'm really going to dedicate my life to love, I do think that's a step toward Jesus. Now, that person may not be wanting that step, or may not be thinking in their minds a step toward Jesus, but who I see Jesus to be, I would say, you actually took a step closer to Jesus. That's awesome. Like, way to go that you're, now I would say that probably opens a door more to you to see Jesus, the way I see him, but maybe not. But it's still fundamentally based on the logic that we see in Paul and John here. Fundamentally, it's a step toward who Jesus actually is.
Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking about the parable of the Good Samaritan here. Like, I think the main point of that parable was that the Samaritan is from a different tribe, but another angle is also that the Samaritan was of a different religion than the priest and the Levite, right?
Well, they
Like
were the like half breeds. They had some things in common, some things not.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean that's why I love all this. It's like there's no, if love, especially this kind of love is the metric, then anyone's invited to experience this and to live this out. And it doesn't matter what you call yourself or what religion you would say you're a part of, it's like, or lack thereof. You're invited to live a life of love. And if Christians did a better job of modeling this, I think this would be what Christianity would be known for.
right.
But it's not necessarily a unique. This should be, if let's put it this way, if Christians did a better job of this should be uniquely thought of as a Christian trait.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
it's
of course.
not,
Mm-hmm.
to the failure of Christians who have not lived this out well. Not because that's not who God is or who God is asking us to be. And so to me, that is who God is. That is what God is asking of us. And, to your point, I do think there's a lot of atheists that love well and love probably better than a lot of Christians do.
Totally. Yeah. As I was like thinking about this question, I kept thinking about the phrase that I see a lot of atheists put out there of "there's no hate like Christian love," and I didn't even want to go down that road. I mean, they're talking about people being intolerant of homosexuals and just anyone who doesn't believe what they believe, but still calling it love. Like, obviously, that's a huge problem within Christianity, and I don't know. I didn't even want to go down that route because I was more wanting just to ask about how like it seems to be the same. Obviously, there's tons of examples of like really vile, intolerant Christians who are really bad examples of love. But just generally, like when I think about the Christians in my own life, like I don't see them as hateful people for the most part, but they don't seem to be any better than the
Right.
non-believers in my life. They seem to be, just about the same, like just good people all around, but very different theological worldviews.
Okay, so this gets into, I want to respond with a question for you. So my answer is, the unique part of Christian is tied to Jesus. I'm curious then, you seem like a person who's committed to love and to loving your neighbor. How would you define, your sense of it? So are there any limits, right? Because I think that's where, okay, can it be anything? Or can we define love as anything we want to define love as? Or are we going to say, hey, it's got to look like this or not? There are certain things that would not be considered. Obviously, there's like stereotypical arguments that get used, and you reference that you've heard this before. But what about the person that says, I'm in love with my animal, I want to I want to express my love, this is totally normal? Would you go, yeah, that's real love? Or the adult who says, I want to love this child, and this is totally normal, and this is my expression of love? Lots of examples that are extreme like that. But I guess my question is, since your concept of love is not based on Jesus, on what grounds would you exclude or include examples like this? What's your criteria for defining love, in your own pursuit now?
Yeah, so I feel like what you're asking is a lot more specifically about like romantic and specifically sexual stuff, right? With the animal and with the child. To which, like, with those examples, I would say the most important thing is consent, right? Like, that's why it's not okay to have sex with children or animals, because it's abusive without their consent. And even if you get the child's consent, it's still abusive because of the power imbalance. So I think, like, that's just like a really important thing, like, whether you're a Christian or not, that we all need to be aware of, right? The importance of mutual consent with that kind of love. I mean, does that seem like a fair answer?
I don't think it's enough, but yeah, I think it's a good start.
Okay. So
Because I would say, how do you know you have true consent? Because now you're getting into power dynamics, and someone could say, I consented to that, and there's plenty of examples I see, and I go, I don't think that's true consent because there's a power imbalance. But how do you know? How do you know the animal's not consenting? How do you know the child's not? Like, on what grounds are you saying no to that consent?
yeah, well, I mean, obviously with a child versus with an animal are very different, I guess. But they're both, I don't know, they're both in this kind of like kind of repulsive area. Like with an animal, for example, it's kind of just this strange inconsistency we have of, like, as a society, like, we think it's okay to eat animals, but we don't think it's okay to abuse them sexually. Like, I would say, like, both of those are, like, going against the animal's consent. And, like, in any case, with whatever you do with an animal, of course an animal can't talk and can't have a conversation with you. But I think it's easy to see why they're not consenting if they resist you, right? If they react to pain, like when you step on your dog's tail when he's laying on the ground and he just yelps in pain and scurries away. Like, yeah, it doesn't take a genius to figure out what's happening there. Like, no one enjoys uh, people preying upon them, people abusing them, people inflicting pain upon them. I don't think you need Christianity or the teachings of Jesus to come to that conclusion. And I think, like, of course, with all of these things, there's tons of gray area, like with the idea of childhood consent. Of course, 18 is the age of consent where you could be like a 96-year-old dude dating an 18-year-old girl, and technically that's legal, but a lot of us would still think, like, is that what's going on there? A lot of people might have questions about that. And so, that's just like, we have to put a number on it somewhere in terms of the law. But I mean, all of these things are a negotiation, I would say. And I would say that's true whether you're um whether you're following the Christianity version of love or not. You know what I mean? Because the Bible is so ambiguous and open to interpretation, and no one agrees on what it means to love your neighbor. Even like New Testament, Romans 13, Bible believing Christians, right? Am I not answering your question? What are you looking
I'm
for?
still
here?
waiting for your criteria. What's your criteria for love? How do you define what's love and what's not love?
What's love and what's not? Like, treating other people well, treating others as you'd like to be treated, like the golden rule there, treating others as they would like to be treated, as far as you can tell. Like, if you can have a conversation with them, that's how you figure out how they would like to be treated. If you're dealing with an animal, obviously you can't have that conversation, but I think you can use your own logic and reason and intuitive nature to see, like, if you're hurting this person, then you're not loving them.
So, so your answer is, as long as you're not harming someone, that's love?
No, I think if you're treating them well, that's love. If you have, love in terms of just like the emotional thing of, like, feeling positive feelings towards other people.
I don't know. That's what I'm asking. How do you define love?
How do I define love? Okay, maybe I got really hung up on your qualifiers there with the children and animals thing.
Those are just extreme examples that people use. But the question is, I would define love based on Jesus. You would not. So what are you defining your sense of love on?
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting. You've referenced the golden rule, which I would say was kind of a big Christian idea. Although
Mm-hmm.
I would say the platinum rule trumps that rule, but I don't think that's I don't think that's the atheist argument to a non-Christian love is the golden rule.
Right, because you would say that Jesus like invented that, or was the first to come up with that, or
Jesus was the first that I've ever found recorded that use it in the positive. So there's numerous examples in the negative, which is
Mhm.
don't harm people or don't do to others what you wouldn't want them to do to you. And I've used this in a sermon before. I'd have to look at them. There's like 3 examples before Jesus that people use that idea in the negative. Do not do to someone what you would not want them to do to you. Okay.
Mhm.
Jesus is the first that I've ever found recorded that said it in the positive. Do to others what you want them to do to you. So it's the same concept, right? He didn't invent the concept, but he's saying it, I would say, in a much stronger way. But then I would say the platinum rule, Jesus says, as I have loved you, now you go love other people, which now supersedes that. It's not just how do I want you to love me? It's I'm going to love you directly how Jesus has loved me, which goes to John 4:7. So again, that's the Christian flavor of it. So I'm guessing I'm still not clear. What's the non-Christian flavor of love? How is it? How do I understand how to love if I don't want to use Jesus? What am I using?
Okay. I think you should just use the example of treating other people well, like having other people's best interests in mind, and obviously that's going to change depending on the circumstance. But like if someone is hungry, you give them something to eat. If someone needs help crossing the street, help them with that. I think, like this kind of idea of brotherly, mutually beneficial love is all of us treating each other well. Is is that not a good definition? Is
Seems pretty
that too
vague.
vague?
Yeah, it seems pretty vague.
Okay. Well, what do you think would be a better one besides Jesus?
I don't know. That's why I think Jesus is a more compelling version. I would say if you lose Jesus, you have this is my argument. I don't think they're all these people talk about love. If you're not
Mm-hmm.
talking about Jesus, you have a vague concept of what love is then. Because like what's it
Mm-hmm.
I'm still waiting. Like what's it based on? Like how do I know if I'm really loving that person? And if it's just what they want, what if the drug addict wants another fix? Is the most loving thing for me to do to give them the fix that they need in the moment because that's what they want? Or is the more loving thing to do to tell them no because I think that's ultimately better for them? Based on what you said, I would say I give them the fix because that's what they want.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. All these things are very complicated and nuanced, but I mean, like Jesus also didn't like say anything about how we should treat drug addicts, right?
Right. But my ethic of, okay, how do I love you the way God has loved me? Then I would use that criteria. So I guess I'm not understanding what's the criteria. How would I navigate to know in that situation? If it's not based on Jesus, what am I using to know what's the most loving
I think it's
way to
what
treat them?
doing what's best for them. Like in the case of the drug addict, and again, this is I don't even know what the answer to that is. Like, should should you give them their fix or should you let them ride it out? I mean, it depends on so many things with that, right? Because there's the debate about the decriminalization of drugs and the way like different countries handle that. But yeah, I guess I don't see how like Jesus changes that when you get into like these specific ethical questions because Jesus didn't talk about most of the specific ethics that we deal with in the day to day.
Sure.
Okay, I feel like I'm royally disappointed you with my answer. I'm sorry. Love is a mystery, man. Like it's very vague and very open to interpretation, and it means very different things, and it's always a negotiation.
Okay. I'm just gonna say I think that does not sound as good to me as the Christian flavor of love. But
Yeah.
that's my own opinion on that one.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think that's the problem is if anything can be love and it's only based on my sense of this is what you want or this is what's best for you.
But no, it's okay. So I disagree with that because I'd say it's a negotiation. Like I'm saying, like if it's me and the drug dealer, and I'm trying to decide, do I give this drug dealer his fix? Do I call the cops on him? Do I send him to rehab? What do I do? It's not just me making a decision. It's the drug dealer also. I mean, the drug addict. I mean, with all people, like, you need their consent. Like, to go back to the beginning of the question, right?
I'm trying to think. I read a book recently, and I can't think of the title off the top of my head, but she makes this whole argument of we obviously, and it's mainly kind of like romantic love in the concept of this book. But her argument is we start with consent, but she makes this whole argument of how consent isn't enough. And it was actually a really interesting point. And that's what, kind of as I'm teasing out these questions of like, how do you know? Like, how do you really know consent? Mm-hmm. Consent, I think, sounds great on paper. And if it's not there at all, then yeah, that's a clear case of abuse. But even when it is there, I think there's a lot of, it's your 96-year-old and the 18-year-old. Mm-hmm. Is that consent? There's like a lot of that kind of stuff that you go, if all we say is consent, then you would check the box and go, yep, it's good. It's consent. They both consented. And, there's just times where it's like, that kind of feels gross. Or I think of, I'll internalize it to the Christian world. There's a lot of times, like in church ministry, pastors, have abusive relationships with people, and then, they consented to it. It's like, you're in a leadership role of spiritual authority. Mm-hmm. You're going to argue that that's that person's able to truly consent, with someone who has this heightened sense of influence. To me, so it's not just, I'm not picking on atheists. I'll pick on anybody.
Sure. Yeah.
The consent idea, I think, is just not enough by itself. Love's got to go beyond that. I don't know. It's just my recent thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, and of course the clergy, we should mention, does not have a spotless record when it comes to sexually abusing children. So
totally.
I don't know. Again, I just feel like with all of these like specific ethical questions, like a lot of them are really complex and nuanced, and we could debate them all day. And I don't really see how Jesus speaks into any of those, right? Like, Jesus doesn't say a 96-year-old can't date an 18-year-old either. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But yeah, I'm humbled by my lack of having a coherent answer to your question, Jeremy. I'll have to think a lot more about it. So I appreciate you challenging me on that.
Maybe we can revisit it at a later episode.
Yeah. What is love anyway?
What is love?
Final question for you. In verse 11, we're talking about what I'm pretty sure is some end time stuff from Paul's perspective, where he says, "This is all the more urgent, for you know how late it is. Time is running out. Wake up, for our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed." So, like I said, you could interpret this different ways, I suppose, because you could say, like, it's not about the end times, it's about you're going to die someday, so your salvation is upon you. But anyway, I'm interpreting it as like Paul thinks Jesus is coming back soon, because as I understand, that's how the early church saw it, because that's what Jesus said. He said he's coming back soon. And we've talked about this before, where I asked you about, like, what about the part when Jesus says, like, some of you will not taste death? And you had, like, an interesting answer for that, which I appreciate. But I think the problem with Jesus's perpetually imminent return is that it's kind of unfalsifiable, right? Like, it's been 2,000 years, Christians are still waiting, and there's a way to see that as aspirational and hopeful, or there's a way to see that as, like, kind of sad and pathetic. Like, what are you guys waiting for? It's not going to happen. Which I don't mean to be insulting. I realize that's a little bit insensitive to say it that way. But anyway, I just in light of the unfalsifiability problem that I just brought up, is there anything that might cause you to doubt that he's actually coming back?
It's an interesting question. I've thought about this, and I don't have like a real complex answer to it. My thought is, when I look at like what Paul was saying in verse 11, is Paul's probably trying to address apathy in the church. They probably are like, yeah, whatever. Let's, we'll get around to following Jesus eventually. And he's like, wake up. Like, your time's running out. Like, you need to do this. So I think I almost sense like a pastoral heart here, that Paul's like, look, I'm trying to address, like, you guys are acting like none of this matters, and I'm trying to tell you it matters. But then also, I think in their lifetime, with what they had seen, they probably all did think it was going to be quick. And I think we have to acknowledge, like, from their point of view, Paul probably thought it would not have been another 2,000 years. And it doesn't bother me to acknowledge that I think that's probably where Paul was going with that. For me, I would say the only thing that would really cause me to doubt, like, this is not going to happen, is if I stop believing in Jesus. Then I'd be like, yeah, that it all goes together. And, if I don't think Jesus is real, then, but here's what I would say. And I don't know your reaction to this. This doesn't actually shape a ton of the way I follow Jesus day to day. So it really seems like, yeah, I mean, I believe it's going to happen, but I would say if I have a problem in this, it's that I tend to think the other way. I assume it probably won't happen in my lifetime. And so if anything, I'm probably on the apathetic end of the spectrum, that Paul would be like, wake up, like, hey, act like this is happening now. And I'm like, yeah, but Paul, it's been 2,000 years and odds are, it's not going to be my lifetime. Yeah. Like, so to me, and again, I try to follow Jesus in such a way of, it wouldn't matter if Jesus came back today or tomorrow or, 100 years from now, like, I'm still going to follow Jesus today the same way. So to me, it doesn't really shape anything that I'm going to decide, other than it gives me a sense of hope that I do think God's going to ultimately redeem all of this, which then gets into, my view of, like, Jesus is going to make all things right at the end of all this. And that's what eternity looks like, is Jesus coming back and making things right and redeeming everything that's been broken. So from that point of view, I live with the hope of that. But I wouldn't say I'm on the edge of my seat looking at the sky every day thinking, is that him?
Yeah, it doesn't affect your day-to-day life in that way.
And I say that almost with, like, an acknowledgement that maybe it should, and even as I was thinking about your question, I'm like, is there something wrong with me? Like, am I a bad Christian because I don't have, like, a huge sense of urgency here? But honestly, I don't know what would I do different if I thought, like, I would still follow Jesus the way I'm following Jesus. So I don't even know if I thought truly it was going to be a month from now. I mean, I may make different financial decisions, but
yeah, especially with your end with zero mentality, right?
Or die with zero, yeah.
You got a lot more.
Yeah, I got to burn through all this in a month. That's a good point, Jeff.
Yeah, that's true. That's good. I agree with you in terms of, like, what Paul's really getting at here is, like, time is short. Like, don't waste time. And like I was saying in the question of, I feel like you could interpret that even if you don't believe Jesus is ever coming back, like, either way, it's like, time is short. So,
well, I do
what you got to do while
you mentioned this. I like the literal reading of, like, our salvation is nearer now than when you first believed. Well, yeah, you're also nearer now to death than when you first believed.
Right,
like,
right.
And
yeah.
every day you could say it. Every day would be true.
Every day you're one day closer to death, for sure. Yeah.
Which there's part of that that's, just a fundamental, like, live in the moment, be present, don't put off till tomorrow. You don't have tomorrow. Like, there's, at some point for all of us, there is no tomorrow. I don't know what that is for me, but I'm going to live, now. And so I don't know, again, it's just like Paul's pastoral heart coming out. Was there apathy in the church he was dealing with? Were there certain people that needed a little kick in the butt, to follow Jesus? Like, I don't know if there's some of that in this, but today I don't know. What I would say is the traditional Christian view of hell gets used with this of hurry, 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 or else these people are going to burn if you don't get them in. Right. So that is definitely a Christian way of understanding this. It would not be my answer, but I do want to acknowledge there's probably a lot of people who go, yeah, that's why, because if you don't save them, you don't convert them, they're going to burn in hell and you didn't get a chance. So that would be a way of interpreting it, obviously, because of my view of hell or lack thereof. I don't think that view, but there would be a lot of Christians that would make space for that.
I wonder if just cultural evangelical Christianity is as focused on end time stuff now as it was when I was a kid. Because when I was thinking about this view, I remember, like, when I was a kid, I did have that rapture anxiety and think, like, Jesus is probably coming back within my lifetime. And like we talked about a long time ago, I was like, hopefully Jesus comes up after all the Star Wars movies come out.
Yep.
But I remember also just having like times when it was like, I don't know, like I have a test in school tomorrow or just whatever. Like some
Saying your prayers the night before. Now's a good time, Jesus.
Just some whatever, just something that I didn't want to face like in my near future, and just thinking like maybe Jesus will come back and all of my problems will be taken care of. Like I've said before, I do feel like this is where that kind of becomes a problem, is if people think like we don't need to take care of the environment because God is coming back any day now and he'll make all things new. But I think there's certainly a more pragmatic, positive way to interpret Paul's words here, and saying like, be a good person, be a good citizen, pay your taxes. He says something about like don't go to drunken parties or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which seems a little bit counterintuitive. If the end is coming anytime now, like,
come on, Paul, let us have our moment.
Yeah, maybe you do want to.
Time is running out, Paul.
Let your hair down a little bit.
Yeah, well, which is it? That's awesome.
For some people, drunken parties are not super fun. So maybe Paul just wasn't into that scene.
That wasn't his crowd.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I don't know. I was pushing a little bit more on the unfalsifiability thing of like,
which I agree.
Whole, like,
yeah, there's no way of verifying that. Totally.
Because I've heard some people make the argument that the Second Peter phrase of 1,000 years are like a day to the Lord, that was the Second Peter was written much later, and it was kind of written as a response to that specific passage was written as a response to like
people getting
frustrated.
frustrated.
Jesus say he was coming back soon? It's been like over a generation. A lot of his disciples have died by this point. Like, yeah, it's such an interesting time scale with 1,000 years to a day. So you could say it's only been 2 days at this point. So it's not a very long time to wait. And I was thinking like, how long would you have to wait before you would say like, all right, come on. Like if it was 1,000,000 years, that would only be 1,000 days, which is like 3 years. Is that even unreasonable at that point? I don't know.
I don't know if your brain goes there, but like I do get to this point of like, okay, will there be some invention or some like tipping point in humanity that is like, this is the moment God's like, all right, now, I waited till you got to this point. So I think of it like with AI, like when AI gets fully conscious, is that the moment that Jesus decides like, all right, now I'm coming back? Or is there some tipping point? You want to know one of the most fascinating things that I've ever read? I don't think we've ever talked about this on the podcast. I'm going to drop this at the very end.
Okay.
One of the most fascinating things I've ever read, and nobody is talking about, Jeff, and I literally don't understand. I read a book that was talking about the population of the earth and how that is historically played out. And there are more people alive right now than have ever been alive, and all those kind of things that are kind of like trippy to think about.
Mm-hmm.
And he makes the argument, if you track the birth rates across all countries of the world, you can track this, right? Like, all right, what's the rate of new births and all this, that they can forecast that in the year 2050, we will hit maximum capacity of humanity, at which point it will start going down. And if nothing changes, we'll never recover.
Like it will go down permanently? It won't
permanently
plateau,
from that point on.
Okay.
Because you can track, I mean, again, these are all like, they track numbers. This is not like an opinion. These are like, if nothing changes, if we keep doing what we're doing, keep having kids at the rate we're having kids, that we are under the number required just to maintain the population. And so everyone in our minds, we always talk about, oh, there's too many people. That will be true until 2050. It will grow. And I think they estimated it like 13 million is where they thought like that's going to be, or 13 billion, excuse me.
Billion. Yeah.
That's the peak that they forecast the numbers to get to. But then literally, if nothing changes with the birth rates, it starts going down. And there's no way to recover that unless people dramatically start altering how they have kids.
As in it would go down to zero, given enough time, you mean?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that is hard to believe.
But, and I'd have to remember what book. I remember reading this book, and he's not sensationalizing. He's just literally saying, here are the numbers, and here's why. Like, people are having less kids than they ever have historically. Like, it's been decreasing, and here's all the reason why. And a lot of it is because we're empowering women, right? And so women have their own choice now. So they're not forced into having kids like historically they had been. And like all these different things. But I'm going, Okay, well, that's an interesting, like, in our lifetime, we're going to be alive,
We'll
you
hit the
know,
peak population.
God willing, for the peak of humanity, and
Mhm.
then to experience the decline. Like, isn't that a trippy thought? Like, and again, I'm not a prophet. I don't know, but that just seems like a pretty monumental time in the history of humanity.
What a time to be alive. Yeah.
I don't
I mean,
know.
I guess we could say we were there for the peak, but I mean, it's not like we're gonna notice the effects, right? Because it's gonna be a long, long time before we get back down to zero.
Sure. But, you know, imagine people born after 2050.
Mm-hmm.
You're born into a reality where your worldview is that the population is shrinking.
Yeah, that's true.
We are
That is
born
a
into a
trippy thought.
worldview of the population is growing. So
Mm-hmm.
all of us alive today have that worldview. Like, that's how you view humanity. It's growing. There's more and more people, right? But if everything plays out according to this book, after 2050, anyone who's born is born into a totally different mindset of, no, we're decreasing. And
Yeah.
so how do
So-
you live differently, right?
So
If
Jesus
that
has to
is,
hurry up and come back at least sometime before then.
I
Right?
mean, Jesus, time is running out. You know how late it is. Paul said it.
Yeah.
I don't know. This is the stuff I think about when I think about, like, end times. I'm like, could that be it? Is it the 2050 thing? Like, Jesus waits till we've hit the maximum and then comes back? Like, I don't know.
Honestly, I feel like that would be a miracle if humanity can make it that long by just by going to extinction via low birth rate rather than like nuclear war or climate change or something like that.
But what's interesting to think about is, okay, so it'll, you know, the climate and all that and resources will get worse up until that
Mhm.
year. But
And then
then
it'll get better. Right?
it'll start getting better and the
Sure.
earth would start healing itself again. And it's just an interesting, like, you'd have less people on less resources, and not because of like a plague or anyone dying off. It's just we're not making new humans at the rate we were.
Mm-hmm. This is reminding me of our former guest, Greg Boyd. I've listened to a bunch of his podcast episodes, and he seems to talk about this a lot. He talked about it when he was our guest, but he seems to talk about it a lot in his podcast too, the idea of human extinction. Like,
Yeah.
because one of his episodes was like someone wrote in and asked, like, is human extinction possible, like, biblically? Because, you know, then the end times can't happen the way it does in the Bible. And he was, because he obviously believes in all this stuff with climate change, war. There's so many ways we could end ourselves before end time stuff happens. And he said something like, yeah, if humanity goes extinct, I guess that would be definitive proof that God isn't real. So the atheists win, but there'd be no atheists there to celebrate. So that was his answer to that
It's
question.
a hollow victory.
Which I appreciate. Yeah. Which again, well, I'll just say for the record, I would love to be proven wrong. Like, I don't want to see the end of humanity anytime soon, you know, because I love you guys. You guys are great. And I don't even know what love means.
Full circle. That was beautiful.
Seems like now that we've talked
On
about
that
human
note.
extinction, good way to end it.
Hey, everybody, have a great day.
Any other closing thoughts, Jeremy?
Wow, it did kind of end on an ominous note.
Yeah.
I don't know how to recover from that. I mean, we have some time until then.
Yeah, a few thousand years to get our act together.
No, I'm saying, like, you know, until 2050. That's what I was saying. But
sure.
yeah, I mean, in our lifetime, I'm not going to be around by the time we go extinct. But what's interesting too is, okay, so let's say that happens. Do people start living differently? Do people start having more kids you know what I mean? Like, that's what I think will be fascinating, is like,
that's what I was thinking too, of like, if things get better, then potentially people are happier and, you know, more likely to want to start a family, you know, because I think that's, you know, that's a conversation a lot of young people are having now, of like the ethical question of whether or not you should have children, because, like, do you want to expose a child to this world? Or like, if you believe like overpopulation is a problem that contributes to poverty and starvation and stuff, like, people might make the ethical decision to not bring another child into this world. But, you know, in the future, if that's a non-issue, then people wouldn't have that hesitancy.
yeah, there you go.
There you go.
That's slightly more positive.
Have you read anything on antinatalism, Jeremy? I'm guessing you're not an antinatalist based on
I don't even know what that is.
the fact that you have 5 kids. Oh, really? That's the view that it's unethical to bring a child into this world because it's you're automatically going to expose them to suffering, and if you don't bring a child into this world, then they will experience zero suffering. Yeah, it's interesting. David Benatar wrote a book called "Better Never to Have Been," where he makes that argument.
Jeez. That's
Yeah.
kind of a downer.
Yeah.
That's your way of bringing us back up.
Very, very, very bleak.
We're trying to end it on a happier note. And then you're gonna go with that,
worldview.
huh?
Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. Well, yeah. We'll end it there. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Before this gets more depressing.
Yeah. I guess in conclusion, it's all gonna end soon, and who knows what love is anyway.
Time is running out.
Time is running out, so get those 5-star reviews in while you still can. And I'm going to be sharpening my fangs for chapter 14 next week. It's going to be a good doozy. See you then.